press one more button, and that works too. That's a miracle. Kia ora tātou, or I should say kia ora whānau. It's great to be back. And although I think this will be ultimately an optimistic presentation, I don't want to pretend that we don't face a lot of potential rips and dangerous currents at the moment. Continuing the nautical analogies, turtle hatchlings are well known in their first hours on this earth as they break out of their eggshells for the perilous dash from the beach to the sand. And if you Google quickly, you'll find the confident assurance in lots of articles that there's a survival rate of no more than 1 in 1,000. That's 1/10 of 1%, which is not especially good odds. But it's also not actually true. That 1 in 1,000 figure relates to the survival rate to adulthood. In fact, 93% of the hatchlings get into the ocean. There's only an attrition rate of around 7%. So, first lesson, not all the horror stories are true, but every percent is a turtle. So people are suffering. But I think even more crucial lesson from this is that what keeps that figure so high is the inbuilt biological compass inside these hatchlings, which makes them drive relentlessly towards the ocean and the horizon. They know where they are going and they go there very fast and directly. If they had any divergence or were set off in the wrong direction, their chances of survival would actually drop quite significantly, because there are lots of seagulls and other predators waiting to snaffle up the tasty young hatchlings. So I think that is perhaps one of the biggest lessons for us in difficult times. During these times we hear a lot about doing more with less. I'm not sure if you can read the fine print, but it says do more with less, work harder and harder, and actually accomplish less. If you make the mistake of Googling do more with less, you won't completely break the internet, but you will get 3,800 million hits in your first second. So this is not a new idea, and it's certainly not restricted to our country or our experience. It's not the first time people have been bombarded with these sometimes sincere, sometimes sanctimonious messages to do more with less. One of my favourite cartoonists is Dilbert, or his cartoon character is Dilbert, and even he has a cartoon on doing more with less. So Dilbert's evil boss there says, "We have to learn to do more with less." And Dilbert says, "Less meetings? No, we'll need more meetings to figure out how to do more with less." "Less micromanagement," says his colleague. "No, I'll have to watch you more closely than ever before to make sure you're doing more with less. I'm talking about using less money." "Oh, like a death spiral. Why didn't you just say that in the first place? It's as if you were talking more to say less. She'll be more or less like you." I think that also says an awful lot about some of the rhetoric. Because this is a community research AGM, I am going to share with you 3 bits of research that I think actually have something significant to say. But I'm going to spend most of my time telling you a story. It's a true story, and if I was a researcher, I'd call it a case study. But as far as I know, no one has actually written it down yet. So it's an oral history as well. So let's tell the story first, and then I'll briefly refer to these other bits of research which help explain, reinforce a little bit of what was going on in this story. Okay, I was in the UK a few years ago doing some work, and these events were relayed to me by the ops manager for the UK and Europe division of this nameless international organisation. This nameless organisation is mostly involved in international development work around improving the position of children in third world countries. And in the UK, its main work is actually raising money to send overseas. But, as it also does in Aotearoa New Zealand, this same organisation does have a smallish, by comparison, domestic program targeted at disadvantaged and vulnerable children in the UK. At the time that this story began, which was before I was there, Margaret Thatcher had just come to power and very soon introduced a thing called compulsory competitive tendering, CCT, as it became known, among many other changes. CCT applied not only to services such as catering, cleaning, security and transport, but also to all the major programs that councils themselves ran, including childcare. And children's centres was one of the things that this anonymous organisation had been successfully operating. A small number of childcare services in particularly disadvantaged and abandoned communities, focusing on promoting inclusion of children with disabilities, reaching out to the traveller community, which is the gypsy community, and promoting maintenance of language and culture for ethnic minority community children. And it was doing all of that rather well. So when councils started contracting out their childcare services, it started to win more and more contracts. And it grew remarkably fast and to become quite an extensive network of childcare services across the UK, from a very small number to a large number in a short time. And in fact, they were so successful, they were going baroque. The reason for this, which is a reason that's not unfamiliar to many organisations in Aotearoa New Zealand, is that the government didn't quite fund 100% of what they were doing. And they didn't want to cut back the quality or inclusiveness of their approach, because that was their reason for doing it. So, I forget the exact figures, but say 85% of each new service was funded by the contracted service. So in other words, they were having to find 15%. And when it was just a few centres, that 15% was a small amount of money. Each year, as the number of centres increased, that 15% became bigger and bigger, eating away at their reserves. Each year, their treasurer warned them that they couldn't keep on doing this forever, they had to change, but it was not an easy problem to solve, so they basically smiled and nodded at the treasurer and did nothing much about it, until it finally came to the point that they were approaching using up all of their reserves, which had been accumulated over several decades. The treasurer ultimately resigned at this point because people were not listening, and they had to do something about it. And of course, there is nothing like a good financial crisis, or any crisis really, to spark creativity and imagination. Now I'm going to skip over what actually happened in reality, because it was a long process before they actually got to their solution. And there were a lot of dead ends, there was industrial disputes, there were a lot of things that didn't work out, a lot of false starts. But ultimately, they did come up with a solution, though it was one that was not without the risks. The solution was that they would, I'll just do that again on visually. What I forgot to say was, if you look at that bar chart as their budget, there's a little grey dotted line about 2/3 of the way down. Under that dotted line represented the money they raised themselves. Above the line, about just over 2/3, around 70% of the money came from these contracts. So they'd become, at this point, very dependent on those government contracts. Ultimately, after much soul searching, they decided to stop doing these childcare services that were losing them money. So they were able to shrink down to 30% of their former size. And of that 30%, most of it was now coming from their own fundraising, so it was unrestricted. They could use it how they liked. Before I go to tell you how they used it, I wanted to expand a little bit on what that shrinking meant, what getting out of childcare meant. This anonymous international organisation, when it worked in other countries, would never think of going in and delivering services to people. It always helped support local people deal with local problems in the way that was most appropriate for them. So it had a support role rather than a doing role itself. And it suddenly, at the end of its tether, decided that's what it would do locally. So it decided to support local communities to run those childcare centres rather than running them themselves. It went to each of those communities one by one to find people who might be interested in doing that, starting with the parents, but other interested community groups and others. They were honest about the fact that they were losing money, but they also did the figures and suggested to people, without the overhead costs of a London head office, which was actually quite substantial in monitoring all these services when they ran themselves, and if they got additional local volunteers to do certain things, then it could be a viable option to them to run locally. And pretty much all of the programs were in effect successfully handed over. They were not really handed over because the local funders retendered, but effectively they were handed over to those groups. So they shrunk their size, got out of the delivery of childcare business. What did they do with their shrunken budget? Well, they did two things. The first of which was they wanted to support those now independent childcare centres. So they spent the big half, it was more than half, but the first part of their shrunken budget on providing training, for example, training on disability inclusion for the staff of these childcare centres. They provided resource material, so resources on non-violent, anti-sexist, anti-racist curriculum. They provided other kinds of support and assistance. Because in fact, some of those things are more effective operated centrally, rather than each childcare centre having to reinvent the wheel of how to do that. And they also shared their experience on outreaching to isolated and disadvantaged communities, including travellers and others. The big difference was, now they were no longer running the centres, and this was no longer a part of the package deal that all the centre staff had to participate in. They had to win people to the idea that they were doing something useful here. And because what they were doing was actually useful, they did. Not only did all the old childcare centres join up to get their resources, but other nearby childcare centres saw these, on the recommendation of the others, saw this is good curriculum, this is helpful policy, this is great training, can we participate too? And the marginal costs of adding a few more people to a training program or accessing curriculum or advice and support is relatively small. So the organisation was able to do that with quite a degree of ease. The upshot of this was they were actually reaching more people, more children, with their quality programs when they stopped doing them themselves. Let that sink in for a moment. They were having a bigger impact by not doing it, but by supporting others to do. The other bit of their money, they spent on something completely different. For a long time in their strategic plan, they updated theirs every 2 or 3 years, just like you. But this had gone through several strategic plans. They had in there a goal to get the European Parliament to include a child impact process for all new European legislation, so that it would look at the impact on children of whatever they did. So every year they would write a letter, probably an email I guess these days, to Brussels, and they'll get a reply from Brussels saying, thank you very much for your suggestion, we'll take it into account. And of course they never did. There was no change after many years of lobbying by letter writing. So they said, well, why don't we, just for the next 3 years, actually spend the rest of the chunk of our unrestricted money on a proper advocacy campaign. We'll do opinion polling. We'll do one-on-one lobbying with MPs that we think, European MPs that we think might be susceptible to these ideas. we'll get an accounting firm to do a cost-benefit analysis about how having a child impact process actually saves money in the long term. So they did lots of things, many of which cost money, not all of them, but many of which cost money, and in a concentrated campaign, they put real resources into it. They just gave themselves 3 years. They said, if we don't get this over the line in 3 years, we can stop, know we gave it our best shot, and then move on and use this money for something else. Miraculously, just before the 3 years were up, they did actually get this proposal over the line, and the European Parliament today still has a child impact assessment process for all new legislation. But of course, these days, they now have to keep an eye on the process and keep the bastards honest, as someone said, and to make sure that the stuff is being taken into account, and their lobbying has shifted in a slightly different direction to do that. But overall, certainly in the view of the ops manager for Europe, for this organisation, she said unequivocally they were having a much bigger impact now that they'd shrunk to less than 30% of their former size. And that's really the difference between effort and effect. We sometimes get obsessed with the effort that we're making, how much did we do, how well did we do it, whereas the most important thing, when we really think about it for anything more than a minute, is the effect. How close are we getting to making the world a better place for children to grow up in, which was their mission, or whatever our individual organisational mission is. So they had, almost inadvertently, and certainly under pressure of finances, suddenly become much more aware of their effect and much less obsessed with their effort. So effort is really only important if your main purpose is to build a better empire. But if you're not into empire building, then effect remains the most important thing. And this is all about having leverage, maximising the leverage that we get over others and in different situations. The first bit of the research comes from a guy called Saxton from the UK, and he was separately writing about charities around about this time, and one of the things he said is the scope is severely limited if any organisation must do it all themselves. So this implies we will actually have a bigger impact or effect if we shift from seeing ourselves just as doers. Doesn't mean we stop being doers, but that's not the end of things. Shift from just being doers to being catalysts for change and focusing on the purpose, the vision, the horizon we're swimming towards, like those little hatchlings. Focus on results and social impact, not just activities and programs, which can mean growing small, as it did for this organisation. It's not necessary to grow small to have a bigger impact, but size doesn't matter in this particular case. And it will be harder to see and count this impact. It's a much higher risk strategy. They were spending over a third of their resources on this one advocacy campaign for child impact statements in Europe. They could have spent all of that for 3 years to no effect, but they took the risk. It did pay off in this case, but equally it might not have. But they were willing to take the risks in order to get the bigger change. Saxton goes on in his research to talk about 5 shifts that are a part of this different way of thinking, or paradigm shifts. The first one is we stop thinking about the real work as only the direct services we provide, and everything else is an overhead or a icing on the cake or just a luxury. And we are focusing on the real work is whatever takes us closer to the vision, whatever gets us closer to the vision, even if we don't do it ourselves. It's a shift from we're just doing other people's dirty work because they won't do it, the kind of poor me mentality, to an approach which is proud because others want to support our cause, others want to be engaged in this too, others are committed to the ideas that we think are important. It's a shift from the kind of accountability that focuses on we run X programs for Y people in Z locations, which this organisation was able to tell very precisely before the change, to the idea has spread so rapidly we've got no idea how many people are doing well. I won't tell another story about that. I'll say that for another day. The fourth shift is from we keep out of politics and stick to providing services to we have become more influential and effective. So it's about influence, not about politics. And people, it's a shift from people give to help a charity do good work to people give to see effective change. Now, moment of truth, a little bit of honesty. That that anonymous organisation, they said that the hardest thing that they found was trying to achieve that last change. Their donors were the hardest people to convince. And in fact, they probably were only able to succeed because most of their donors didn't know what they were doing. Most of their donors were giving to the name, which had a good reputation, or to what they knew the organisation had done in the past, and were not too focused on what changes may or may not be happening now. So that is a change that they found really hard to put into practice. Though they were working at it when I was there last, I haven't checked up with them recently, so I'm not sure whether they've made any progress on that yet. But I actually think there's great hope in this next generation of donors, because the young people that I'm in touch with still want to commit to causes. They actually want to see changes. A previous generation of volunteers and donors was loyal to organisations. That's what kept this organisation going, even when they changed. But I think the next generation and the current generation of volunteers and donors is much more focused on real change and causes. So I think there's much more possibility there than there has been ever in the past. Second bit of research I want to focus on quickly is what makes high impact. So we move across the Atlantic from the UK to America, and this is based on some work that Crutchfield and McLeod Grant did using the methodology of Jim Collins and his good to great research in commercial organisations, and they applied it to non-profits. First of all, what makes a high impact is not what you think. It's not big budgets, it's not low overheads, it's not perfect mission statements, it's not even a breakthrough new idea, some of them are really old and boring ideas, nor is it high brand awareness, and it's not even best practice management techniques, even though we spend most of our day trying to train people in doing those things. They don't actually get you from good to great. They might be useful to get you to good or to get you to okay, but they don't get you from good to great. What their research found was surprisingly similar outcomes, that greatness has more to do with how non-profits work outside the boundaries of their own organisation than how they manage their own internal operations. They influence and transform others in order to do, and they use that phrase again, more with less, but I think they're using that in a much more useful way. So in particular, and I'm just going to go through this really quickly, but if people are interested, I can just email me and I can send you some summaries of their research which go into a bit more detail. They looked at looking outside the boundaries of the organisation in 4 areas, and essentially they were looking at 4 key stakeholder groups. So in terms of the relationship with the government, what they found was the most effective organisations in terms of impact combined both advocacy and service, and the combination was more powerful than either of them alone. So it's not saying one is better than the other, but working together for a whole lot of reasons we don't have time to go into is a much more powerful way of influencing change for good. The second area was in terms of the relationship with business. And I think in our sector, we fall into one of 2 big errors. We either see the world of business as the devil, and we have to bring garlic and a silver cross whenever we get close, or we see everything as if only we could be more business-like. And both of those extremes, I think, are useless. What they found in their research was the most effective organisations made markets work for their mission. So it's things like the people who organise consumer labelling, just to give a quick example, you know, the dolphin-friendly tuna. They use the power of consumer choice to change the fishing practices of a whole lot of tuna operators by giving the few good ones this seal of approval as dolphin-friendly tuna, and that changed the practice of pretty much the whole industry. The third area is how our relationship with other non-profits, community organisations and groups, and essentially what this research from McLeod and Crutchfield and McLeod Grant, sorry, I have to say it in the right order to get it going, was that the most effective non-profits gave stuff away. They did not hold information as proprietary, in confidence, commercially sensitive, or tried to use it for their personal competitive advantage. They nurtured others, they gave stuff away, they helped others do their work, in effect, by selling the good ideas and good practice so they had a whole army of people doing the things that they wanted to achieve. The fourth area is relationship with individuals, and that's the kind of donors, volunteers, supporters area that we were talking about before. And effectively, what they noticed in the highest impact non-profits was that they didn't see donors, supporters and volunteers as free labour, cheap money and other resources to be exploited or extracted, but rather they invested in them as ambassadors or advocates, or if you want to use their language, evangelists for the cause. So they had objectives to make sure every person they touched was evangelizing about the cause, was telling other people, promoting the ideas, not just the organisation but the cause, and that is another way of spreading their influence. Although the biggest impact was these external relations, there were two things inside the organisation that did make a statistical difference, and they were that the most effective organisations were masters of adaptation. They thrived on change, they were able to pivot easily, saw it as fun and energising, not as a threat. And secondly, almost all the most effective organisations had shared, flat or distributed leadership. So they're anti-hierarchical, and especially they delegated a lot of the decision making to the front line in the larger organisations that they looked at. Okay, third one, I'll do even quicker, but it's one of my favourites. This is an African author and a friend of mine, Kaplan, who talks about capacitated organisations and talking about what is the capacity of community organisations or NGOs or non-profits. And there's a list on the overhead of fairly familiar elements. The trouble is, he says, we get it the wrong way around. What we're looking at is like the lily pad on the top of the water, and that's not the most important thing for the water lily. It's actually the roots in the mud that sustain it and keep it alive. So the attractive bit on the top is the money and the training, the skills, people and resources. But the stuff that actually keeps it alive is what he, I think, confusingly calls context and conceptual framework, which I'll define in a minute, and vision. So what he means by context and conceptual framework is that the organisation vehemently believes that there's something wrong in the world and that they can make a difference to make it better. So they have a theory of change about how they make it better, that change for good is possible, and they really believe it, and that is the fundamental thing that makes a difference. That and a vision for what the kind of world we want is really what makes a difference. And then when we've got that, we can add the strategy and the culture, and after we've got the strategy and culture well aligned to our purpose, then that's buttressed by the structure and of course the skills of the people and the resources that we need. But they will follow if we've got that other stuff right. And he tells of his own experience in South Africa when it was flavour of the month in the immediately first post-non-racial elections period. Lots of big donors from around the world were coming with lots of money that they poured into the country. A lot of NGOs grew up out of nothing to take this money and do sometimes quite useful things in their communities. But the real test came when those same donors left the country more interested in whatever was the next flavour of the month, which from memory I think was Eastern Europe. I think that followed South Africa. But there will always be another flavour of the month. And I think that happens domestically too. Even when we might go through a period where we're the flavour of the month, but there will be other people who will be flavour of the month at another time. Those organisations that had just depended on the material resources and skills, the people and money, they completely disappeared when the money dried up. But those organisations that were deeply rooted in their communities, in the mud, securely with a vehement context and conceptual framework and a powerful vision, they survived. Sometimes on the smell of an oily rag until new resources came in, but they survived and persisted. Still, she persisted. So that's the 3 bits of research that I wanted to share, which I think reinforce the lessons that I learned from that case study as well. So I'm just going to finish up, see I've spoken for too long, with 2 quotes. The first one comes from Mr. Rogers. So for those of you who are fans of PBS children's programs, you will know Mr. Rogers, very famous. And one of the things that he's quite famous for saying in his advice to parents when children see bad news or a crisis, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And I think there's a similar message for us in a crisis as well. We need to look for the emerging opportunities. It doesn't pretend that there isn't pain and suffering going on, but we need to look for the green shoots to be open to the new possibilities that is still there, even in the pain and the agony, and even in the difficult times. And often difficult times bring out the best in people, bring out the helpers in a crisis. And the last quote I want to finish with is by Margaret Wheatley, who my claim to fame, my brush with fame, is I once had morning tea with her. It was at a conference and she was stuck, but I'm not resiling from that. But one of the things that she said that's always impressed me is there's only one way through a dark night, and that's to illuminate the truth of who we are, peering through the darkness to find those values, that identity that holds its own luminosity. As we reclaim our ideals, we find the way forward, the path illuminated by our refound clarity about who we want to be. So thank you, Margaret. That's it.
Thank you.
Tēnei au ko te hōkai nei o taku tapu ai, ko te hōkai nuku, ko te hōkai rangi, ko te hōkai i ato tūpuna a tāne nui ārangi. I pikitia ai ki te rangi tūhāhā ki te tihi o Manono. I roko hina atu rā ko i o matua kore anake. I riro iho ainga ki te o te wānanga, ko te kete tua uri, ko te kete tuatea, ko te kete aronui. Ka tiritiria, ka paupaua ki a papa tuanuku, ka puta, te ira tangata ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama, tihei, mauri ora.